World War One, 9 million soldiers and airmen and sailors died. A further 7 million civilians died. 50 million died from Spanish flu, exacerbated by wartime conditions. A military historian in Britain called John Keegan wrote these words at the beginning of his book on World War One. The First World War was a tragic and unnecessary conflict. But we don't see that until after the war. So those that come from the peace traditions already know war is a tragic and unnecessary event. But after a war, in the light of the darkness of war, there's a moment of truth. And so the museum here helps us understand the terror of trench warfare, the terror and huge waste of human resources, of people and economies. So there's a moment of truth that comes out the objective study of any war. And so I'm hoping that the backdrop of the museum reinforces the importance of the witness of those who stood against war and stood against the crowd to give another kind of witness.
The Jesus way,
oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
Is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way,
oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
Is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When He is King, all wars will cease. May His peace begin with me. I'm gonna beat my sword,
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword,
Gonna beat my sword
into a plow.
into a plow.
Gonna beat my sword into a plow. Christ is King in my life now. May His peace begin with me. Oh,
Kansas City, Missouri, in the heartland of America, is the home of the National World War I Museum, the only one of its kind. It's dedicated to those who fought and died in that war, and also to those who opposed participation in that war's destruction. In reality, it was a war that many did not support. The United States actively took part in the conflict for only the last 18 months. The war effort introduced mass conscription, resulting in compulsory registration of young men, 18 years of older, and service in the armed forces. When fully activated, over 10,000 U.S. troops a week were sent to fight in Europe. The United States government used propaganda to energize the public with patriotic rallies and the promotion of war bonds. The American economy was transformed into a world power, and people in the United States who believed it was Europe's war were told that it was a war to end all wars. This is Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. Many people desired a negotiated peace and opposed American intervention. 300,000 men refused conscription during the war, and 3 million men did not register for the draft at all. While many did not support the war effort, some even imagined future world orders that could eliminate war forever. The Church of the Brethren was one of the peace churches that openly expressed opposition to the war. There were other religious groups, the women's movement, pacifists, radicals, and labor activists who also dissented. The resistance to the draft during World War I in the United States was large and took many forms, from conscientious objection to failure to register to disappearing, even to armed confrontation. The World War I Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, recently held a symposium titled Remembering Muted Voices. It was about conscience, dissent, resistance, and civil liberties in World War I, continuing through to today. In this program, we'll be taking you back in time with the assistance of several presenters from the symposium. We were able to meet with them individually to get their understanding of those tragic events that cost millions of lives and also led to 50 million people dying from the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1919. We were privileged to meet with conference organizer Andrew Bolton of the Community of Christ Church. Mr. Bolton is from England, and we asked him to give us an overview of the symposium.
So this conference, this symposium, is to look at those who resisted in World War I. Suffragettes, socialists, and of course people of faith, the Quakers, the Mennonites, Church of the Brethren, Hutterites. I'd been touched deeply by the Hutterites story in Fort Leavenworth that I'd come across in England. And the Hutterites story is how we've gathered this coalition of people that's grown now to over 20 co-sponsors. And we've had a small team bring it together, implement it, fabulous support from the museum staff, and it's all happening beginning today. And we will remember all conscientious objectors from every country and all faiths in World War I. Then we're going to hear lots and lots of stories, and there'll be connections of stories to stories. When I started this, we only knew of 2 conscientious objectors who died in Fort Leavenworth. Now we know there's 16 documented. And other people will have bits of the puzzle and will recover these stories and their connections. These stories are really important for young people to know in particular, because they're the life and tradition of a movement.
For those who grew up as members of one of the historic peace churches, it raised the question of what do we do? Obey the laws of the country or the laws of God? Specifically, thou shalt not kill. We asked Andrew Bolton about this.
So most of the conscientious objectors were obviously young people 100 years ago. So they're young people like they are young people, and having to decide in extraordinarily difficult circumstances whether to obey the law of the land, to obey the flag, to obey their country, to obey the law, or to obey a higher law, that of conscience and what Jesus is calling them to do. So I hope that they'll be able to see that young people like themselves were struggling with significant issues, and that might inspire them in their own walk, their own discipleship, their own quest for meaning and purpose in their lives.
Sometimes we have a feeling, as members of a historic peace church, being small in number, and with peace often being controversial and not something that grows a church, we wondered about our significance, and we asked Andrew about that.
So the historic peace churches are very important in the salvation of the world. I can't state that strongly enough. So if you belong to one of the peace churches, if you belong to the Church of the Brethren, you belong to a very significant movement of God in human history. And your help changes the world bit by bit. And one day we'll beat swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks forever. We'll learn no more about war ever again. So we're on a journey, and this weekend is to help equip people for that journey and give them encouragement.
We were also privileged to meet with Bill Koslevy, who is the director of the Brethren Historical Library at the Church of the Brethren headquarters in Elgin, Illinois. Bill is an ordained minister in the Church of the Brethren, has a bachelor's degree in history from Asbury College, a master's degree in history from Marquette University, and a doctorate in history from the University of Notre Dame. For the Brethren, it had to be a critical time, as there were no acceptable ways for their young men to deal with a military draft.
World War I was a crucial transition for the Church of the Brethren. Initially, they were shocked when the war came. They were surprised. Many people believed that there would not be a draft, but in fact there was a draft. And there were no provisions made for people who were opposed to war. The Secretary of War, Newton Baker, the President, Woodrow Wilson, insisted that soldiers' consciences would be respected. But in fact, it wasn't until the second year of the U.S. involvement in the war, early 1918, that provisions for conscience objectors were made. And those provisions were considered inadequate by many brethren. For one thing, the conscience objectors served under military service. They were encouraged to wear military uniforms. And in fact, of course, the folks in the military had no idea what to do with conscience objectors. In Pennsylvania, in places where there were large numbers of Quakers, Mennonites, brethren, often consciences were respected and people weren't drafted. They were given agricultural deferments. Most brethren accepted non-combatant service under the military in the war. Around 200 Church of the Brethren members refused to cooperate. They were often basically put in guardhouses. 11 ended up at the federal prison in Leavenworth. A number ended up in Alcatraz. And the Church of the Brethren was somewhat confused. And so in January of 1918, a special annual conference was held to deal with the war question. And they issued what the Brethren historian Floyd Millot referred to as one of the finest Brethren anti-war statements ever issued. And basically they said people should not serve under military command. They should avoid conscription if they could. If they were conscripted, they were not to wear uniforms, and they were not to take part in, and they were not to drill with weapons. The Church of the Brethren Peace Committee, the leader of that committee, a man by the name of G.M. Henry, was confronted by the federal government, was accused of treason, and him and the two other people on the Central Services Committees were called to Washington, and they basically said Church of the Brethren leaders would be imprisoned if the statement, basically they threatened to imprison them on the spot. And this was somewhat a blatant intimidation attempt. It worked. People like Henry, the Church of the Brethren, backed down. They withdrew the statement and essentially backed down from their earlier strong commitment.
Dan West is a person who was well known to the Brethren for his founding of Heifer Project, which led to Heifer International. Dan had to make a decision about the war.
West had written the Central Services Committee asking what he should do if he was drafted. Should he wear his uniform or shouldn't he? And essentially he got a confused answer encouraging him to accept service under the military in a non-combatant role. When he arrived at camp, his officer was impressed by him, but told him that he would not be, his request to be a non-combatant service was declined. West then asked to speak to the commanding officer. Of course, West was a high school administrator, an articulate person, and after he talked to the commander of the base, the commander sent him home. Most other brethren who were largely from rural areas would be less likely to be able to convince a standing officer. 90% of Church of the Brethren young people served in combat roles in World War II. And in fact, most did in World War I as well. The interesting part of the story is the leaders in the Church of the Brethren during World War II and into the 1960s and 70s were people who were among the 200 who did not serve in their military role in the First World War. So we have the people who struggled with this issue. I mentioned Dan West. M.R. Ziegler was shaped by the World War I experience. Rufus Bowman, later president of Bethany Seminary, who wrote the most important Church of the Brethren book on war, Brethren on War, was committed to pacifism. And people like Gladys Meir, who taught it, who founded the first peace studies program at Manchester University, would have been one of those people. But while many of the church leaders were strongly committed to pacifism, the Church of the Brethren rank and file by 1950 were overwhelmingly supported the military. And in Vietnam, the majority of Church of the Brethren members, there were significantly numbers of Church of the Brethren who were conscientious objectors.
World War I eventually led to World War II. We asked, did the peace churches take any steps to make it easier for their young men to find alternatives to being involved in the military?
The conscientious objectors had proven to be such a problem in the First World War that the government was determined not to repeat that experience. The peace churches also were determined not to have that experience. And so as early as 1936 and early in 1935, when it became clear that another war was probably coming, representatives of the peace churches met with Franklin Roosevelt and other leaders in Washington, and they set up a system for conscientious objectors to serve in civilian public service camps during the Second World War. And these were camps that were actually paid for by the peace churches. And although the experience, different people had different assessments of the experience, CPS workers did perform service in the national interest, fighting forest fires, engaging in agriculture, engaging in forestry work, growing crops, and one of the most famous engaging often in medical experiments at the University of Minnesota. Some of the famous starvation diets were basically in which a number of people actually died as a result of these medical experiments, things that would be frowned upon now.
We were also delighted to be able to meet with Dr. Kirk McGregor of McPherson College, who is in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. For members of the Church of the Brethren, it was not an easy time, as the government attempted to silence resistance to the war. We asked Dr. McGregor to give us an overview of what was happening in the country to promote the war efforts at that time.
All the way back in 1915, President Woodrow Wilson exhibited tremendous skepticism concerning how German Americans in particular would respond if the United States went to war. And so you find in writings of his and speeches of his from 1915 describing German Americans in quite vitriolic, really racist language, saying that these are, the most seditious and the most despised of all people. We can't trust them, and if war ever breaks out, they're like a virus, and we need to use our full power to stamp them out. When war did hit the American front in 1917, Wilson made good on his threats. He implored Congress to issue the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918. And those acts collectively made it a crime to either cause abandonment of the war effort or to attempt to cause abandonment of the war effort. So that if you tried to dissuade people from joining the Army or the Navy, and even used any type of moral exhortation to say one ought not to be doing this, those were considered crimes. Dissuading people from purchasing war bonds, that was considered criminal as well. Reproaching the uniform of the armed forces was considered criminal. Any type of speech against the war effort was considered criminal.
The Brethren were certainly at risk during this time. To speak against the war could put you in prison for 20 years. We asked Dr. McGregor about what Brethren could do in the face of cooperating with the war effort.
Most Brethren young men did not resist the draft. They didn't try to evade the draft. Rather, they declared themselves conscientious objectors, and that they seemed to be willing to take up positions which would not commit them to themselves carrying out any violent acts or learning the arts of war or learning other arts that would contribute to the destruction of human persons or human property. Now, this intention on the part of most Brethren young men was pretty heavily thwarted, or at least it was attempted to be thwarted, by the Secretary of War, Newton Baker. Newton Baker made it his policy to first draft people, so you first conscript people. You don't pay attention to whatever status they may want to claim. You don't ask them about what status they want to claim until after they've already arrived at the camp. And so if you were a CO, then you would have to declare your opposition to military service in the presence of everyone. Fellow soldiers would be surrounding you. Military officers would put pressure on you, bring pressure to bear upon you. And so if you took your stand, then this was a quite difficult psychologically thing to do. And it would mean that if you said, I refuse to don the uniform, which was, of course, against federal law at the time to speak out against the uniform by saying you refused to don it, well, you would basically be put in some type of deterrent or segregation from the rest of the group, and this type of segregation was meant to degrade and dehumanize those who said that they would not fight in combat services. And unfortunately, Baker's strategy of first recruiting, then if you want to be a conscientious objector, you say, well, yes, this is my stand, and then putting the intense pressure on them by segregating them from the rest of the camp and treating them to a life which is pretty much equivalent to imprisonment, that this caused many conscientious objectors, and I'm not just talking brethren, I'm talking sort of the sum total of people who declared as conscientious objectors. Over 2/3 of them eventually served in armed combat. Now, it should be pointed out that most brethren did not take that route. There were some brethren who knew they were violating the church's teaching, and they were fully aware of this. There was no secret, but they decided to serve in military conflict. But the majority of brethren were among that 1/3 which said, no, we're not going to participate in military drilling or donning the military uniform or learning the arts of war. And so this subjected the brethren to extremely harsh treatment. And so it's worth pointing out here that it's not just these brethren young men who are experiencing harsh treatment, like soldiers throwing you up and down until one or more of your arms are broken, or placing you in prison and subjecting you to torture or any other type of thing. This went on at the popular level as well, and it even hit school children. The movement of 100% Americanism basically said that in times of total war, total allegiance to the war effort was required. And that meant that there was a lot of spying done on persons, so that every federal agency, so the Intelligence Bureau of the U.S. Army, the Federal Intelligence Bureau, which would later be called the FBI, even the Post Office, all of the federal agencies had offices set up at various places to spy on alleged unfaithful Americans, and this meant that brethren would be spied on at the time.
Many Brethren, Mennonite, and Hutterite young men, as well as those from other churches, were imprisoned. Those found guilty were sent to federal prisons across the country, from Fort Meade, Maryland, to Alcatraz in California. Many were beaten, tortured, and abused. And at least 596 were held in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, close to Kansas City, Missouri, where the National Museum is. 16 of those died in captivity at Fort Leavenworth, and at least 13 others died at other sites during their captivity. Their crime? Refusing service in the United States military for conscientious reasons.
In the Church of the Brethren as a whole, there were two broad perspectives on what options people could take. One option was to say those who have chosen a conscientious objector and non-violent type of service to the military, where, say, you would work as an ambulance driver or a medic or serve on one of the farm furlough teams or work for the Red Cross, that if you did those things and did not actually participate in the arts of war, then that was acceptable. That was not a violation of the gospel of peace. An equally large proportion of the Church of the Brethren said no, any participation in the war effort, even these seemingly benign acts of participation, were still driving the war engine, and they were at least tacit involvement in the war and tacit support for the war. And so they called for a complete anti-militarism. So the church was of two minds at this time, and the question is, what on earth was the church going to do?
In 1934, the Church of the Brethren affirmed that all war is sin. It also affirmed its Goshen Statement of 1918 that stated, "We believe that war or any participation in war is wrong and incompatible with the spirit, example, and teachings of Jesus Christ." In 1970, it passed a resolution that said, "We, therefore, cannot encourage, engage in, or willingly profit from armed conflict at home or abroad. We cannot, in the event of war, accept military service or support the military machine in any capacity." That brings us up to today. Whereas in the Church of the Brethren, individuals are given the responsibility to determine their conscience. What does your conscience tell you to do? This is Brent Carlson for Brethren Voices, wishing you peace, not war.
The path he trod,
The path he trod,
all those who tread,
all those who tread,
the path he trod,
the path he trod,
all those who tread the path he trod shall be called the friends of God. May his peace begin with me. Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way
Oh, the Jesus way
is the way of peace.
is the way of peace.
Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When he is king, all wars will cease. May his peace begin with me.